Admittedly, this one's a bit of a groaner. Some say that we should end the practice of male circumcision. Personally, I think that they're making a mountain out of a molehill. If you think that one's bad, this one's worse. A woman wanted her son to have a bris, but the husband was against it. Still, she goes against his wishes and she arranges for a secret bris. Just as the bris was getting underway, the husband shows up unannounced. Everyone's in shock. The mother gasps, "How'd you even know?" The father replies, "I could see it coming a mile away." I previewed these with my family and they said, "Can we give you a tip?" And I said, "Sure, what?" They said, "We think you should cut it out." The truth is, neither of these are jokes. Recently, I've had conversations with couples who are struggling with the idea of circumcision. And so this morning, I want to speak about Brit Milah. I raised the topic because I am worried about a trend to not circumcise Jewish boys, and I want to see us recommit to this core mitzvah. Now, I realize that this topic is difficult. For some, of course, just the thought of circumcision makes them squirm. For others, it's difficult because their son or daughter did not circumcise their grandson, and they find that hurtful. I also recognize that there are people here in our Bethel community who have decided against circumcision. At the same time, they're here because they love Judaism and want to pass on the tradition, and we want them to be here. With all of these in mind, I'll do my best to address the issue forthrightly and also sensitively. Yesterday, I officiated at a bris. There was everything you'd expect at a bris. There were tears of joy, tingled with some tears of sorrow as the family named the baby after a recently deceased beloved grandfather. There was, of course, some squeamishness and some anxiety, and there was also a l'chaim. What more could you ask for? There was one more thing, the mother's question. Why would men in a patriarchal religion make circumcision of all things a core practice? Moreover, if Judaism runs through the woman, what really is the point of the bris? Good questions. And this week's Parsha provides an opportunity to explore. We read this morning about Shem and his people, the Hivites. Admittedly, this is a very difficult story. In previous years, we've discussed how Shem took Dinah, how he raped her and held her captive. That is a separate sermon. For now, though, I want to look at the follow-up of the story. As the story unfolds, it turns out that Shem actually loves Dinah, and he wants to marry her. Dinah's brothers agree on one condition, that Shem and his people are circumcised. They agree to do so, and then in their weakened state following the circumcision, Dinah's brothers Shimon and Levi, they attack. They take revenge on Shem and his people for their treatment of his sister, and they free Dinah. Again, there's lots to unpack that we'll leave for another time. For now, I want to focus on the words of the brothers who say, "We will not give our sister to a man who is uncircumcised, for that is a disgrace among us. Only on this condition will we agree, if every male among you is circumcised. Then we'll give our daughter to you, and we'll take your daughters for ourselves, and we'll become one family. Vayomru alehem lo nuchal la'asot hadavar hazeh letet et achotenu leish asher lo orla ki cherpa hi lanu." This is, according to our Chumash, the earliest source stating that non-Jewish males require circumcision for conversion. Now, this passage is not the halachic or the legal source commanding circumcision. That appears back earlier in Breshit when we first meet Avraham. But this passage does give us some insight into the history of Brit Milah. According to the JPS Torah commentary, Semites in Transjordan, Phoenicia, and Asia Minor, they all practiced circumcision. Already 500 years before Avraham, Egyptians were practicing circumcision, as indicated in pictures and in mummies and on carvings. On the other hand, the Philistines were derisively called uncircumcised. So too, here in our Parsha, the family of Shem, who were not Semites, they too were uncircumcised. We learn from this that circumcision, it was not at all unique to the Jewish people. Many of their neighbors practiced this rite. What was unique was the timing and thus meaning of this act. You see, for other Semites, circumcision was associated with puberty. The Torah's shift to infancy marks a radical break with the existing practice, and it imbues it with an entirely new significance. Circumcision was no longer a sign for physical maturity, rather a symbol of spiritual connection. It's a sign of the eternal covenant between God and the Jewish people, performed dafka on the generative organ. Brit Milah affirms that the covenant is to be passed on from generation to generation. So to the mom's question from yesterday, no, a bris does not make a child Jewish. If the mother is Jewish, the child is Jewish. If the child converts, the child is Jewish. Unlike, for example, baptism, that is a sacrament that makes the child Christian, Brit Milah is just a mitzvah. And therefore, if parents choose not to have their child circumcised, on the one hand, they're just not fulfilling one of the mitzvot. If they had him circumcised in the hospital before the 8th day, without the blessings, they've only performed milah, circumcision. They haven't had a bris. They haven't brought him into the covenant. And yes, we might say, it's just one mitzvah that they passed over. There's another 612 to do. Still, over the centuries, Brit Milah has become a foundational Jewish practice, one that overrides Shabbos, even Yom Kippur. Circumcision is the Jewish people's oldest mitzvah. Although the law was eventually given to the Israelites on Mount Sinai, as I said, it was first introduced to Avraham hundreds of years earlier. In fact, it's the only specific mitzvah given to Avraham. In that sense, it has literally been a sign for each and every generation, linking the newest Jew directly to the very first Jew who lived almost 4,000 years ago. And Jews have gone to tremendous length to uphold this mitzvah. In the time of the Maccabees, some Jews, in an effort to assimilate into Greek culture, they actually reversed their circumcision. Hard to believe there is such a procedure, but it's called an epispasm, and it's drawing the skin over the corona. We read in the book of Maccabees, and those Jews sought to make a covenant with the Gentiles. Thereupon, they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to Gentile custom, and they disguised their circumcision, and they abandoned the Holy Covenant. When Antiochus forbade circumcision in 167 BCE, Jewish mothers chose martyrdom rather than neglect this mitzvah. Again, we read in the book of Maccabees, in keeping with the king's decree, they put to death women who had their child circumcised. They also put to death the families and those who had circumcised the children. It was this act of resistance by the mothers and by the Moalim that inspired the Maccabees' revolt. We could look further ahead in history to when the Roman Emperor Hadrian made circumcision a capital crime. We could look later to Christian ridicule of circumcision and to modern times when European countries regularly try to outlaw it. Through it all, Jews tenaciously held on to this practice. Today, once again, there is opposition. Strikingly, though, in this case, sometimes it comes from within the Jewish community. What are the objections? Some object to it for health reasons. I'm not a doctor, but my understanding is that medical opinion has flip-flopped throughout the years about the relative advantage or disadvantage of circumcision, but no research has ever concluded that there is something truly unhealthy about it. Some object because they say that it causes their child unnecessary pain. And I think as you should know that Moalim use various pain relief methods to minimize the discomfort. And while the pain is temporary, the sacred covenant inscribed on the flesh is eternal. Some want their children to decide. And okay, but if the parents don't arrange for a Brit, then it becomes the boy's responsibility when he becomes a Jewish adult. Hard to imagine any 13-year-old making that decision. It is so much easier on the 8th day. Some object to circumcision on theological grounds, and they call it mutilation. They say, if God created the body, then isn't it perfect? Why is it necessary to change what God has made? Already thousands of years ago, the rabbis asked this question. They said, which is better, a stalk of wheat or a loaf of challah? Challah, of course, they said, because have you ever tried eating a raw piece of wheat? In other words, God looks to humans to take nature and to transform it, to partner with God to complete creation. Said differently, God values not just nature, but culture and creativity, spirituality, and the product of human initiative. Circumcision, dafka, performed on the 8th day, 8 symbolizing that which is beyond nature, expresses this very idea. Here at Bethel, we are not in the practice of looking in anyone's pants to see if they are circumcised. Even if we dafka know that they are not, there's no restriction on an uncircumcised Jew from participating in Jewish life, such as having a bar mitzvah. At the same time, this is not a choice we want to encourage. So, for example, I would say that all Jewish children should have a Jewish name or a Hebrew name. But the Jewish naming ceremony for a boy celebrated publicly is a bris. Therefore, we will work with families who are wrestling with circumcision. We'll help them choose a Hebrew name, and we'll acknowledge that name appropriately, privately. As I draw to a close, let me mention that we are blessed to have wonderful Moalim in our town, but we could use some more men or women who are doctors, nurses, or PAs. I invite you to speak to Jeff Estrin or to Bob Karasov or to me about training opportunities. To conclude, let's consider the blessings that we say when we do a mitzvah. When you bench lulav, when you say a blessing for lulav, for example, what do? You say the blessing, you shake the lulav. You're the exact same person before and after the blessing. Not so for a brit milah. The bracha, the second bracha for a brit milah is Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kitshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahachniso bivrito shel Avraham Avinu. God, you have commanded me to enter my child into the covenant of Abraham. He's no longer the same before and afterwards, physically for sure, but also spiritually, because now he is a ben brit. He has entered the covenant. Through this act, he is part of a sacred, unbroken chain of tradition tied to his people and tied to God. May we be privileged to celebrate brises and baby namings, to find meaning in our sacred rituals, and to partner with God to complete creation. Amen.